Thanks everyone for choosing the session. I'm really pleased you're keen to explore area-based inequalities in a bit more detail. And thanks again more generally for joining us this morning. We've been really excited to see you all and have a chance to talk about the book with all of you. We don't have long, so and I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. So I'm going to focus on why this chapter matters to me, the influences behind it, and provide a really quick kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the key messages. If thoughts or questions come to you while I'm talking, it'd be brilliant if you could put them in the chat and we can come back to them. And it's excellent to see that you're introducing yourselves in the chat. That's great. So fire away, jump on in there while I'm talking, get chatting to each other and raise any questions that pop into your head while I'm talking, and we'll do our best to come to as many of them at the end. So I wanted to start talking about the journey to this chapter. So it might be an interesting place to start. So as a teenager at FE college, I spent about 20% of my waking life traveling the whole length of one of the longest bus routes in London, from Sunbury in the outer southwest suburbs to Ealing in the western part of Zone 3 in London to see my girlfriend, who's now my wife. The 235, which incidentally passes right by Manjit School, which is Reach Academy in Feltham. It took about an hour and a quarter to get from one end of its route very, very slowly to the other. For my girlfriend at the time, it was a torturous journey through the grim outskirts of London, and she was over the moon when I finally learnt to drive. But I had a very different take on it. As a child of the outer suburbs, I'd had a fairly happy, privileged, middle-class upbringing, but the suburbs aren't inspiring. Endless residential sprawl, very little else going on. So this bus journey actually felt like an escape. As it slowly weaved its way through the outer zones of the capital, the view from the window grew steadily more busy, more urban, more diverse, ethnically, architecturally, economically. So in short, as happy as I was at home in the relatively leafy suburbs, I felt like this bus route took me to where things were actually happening. And looking back now, almost 20 years on, I can see that the lowly 235 bus route probably kickstarted what will become my near obsessive focus as a researcher. That's on how young people's lives, particularly their aspirations, are shaped by the areas they grow up in, and how young people growing up in types of area that we find on the outskirts or margins of cities and towns often face particular challenges in making a fulfilling transition to adulthood. So this interest in young people growing up on the urban fringes led to my master's research in a primary school near Heathrow, and then my PhD in a City and Guilds training porter cabin near Manchester Airport, both predominantly white, historically working class neighbourhoods. In both cases, I was looking at how young people made sense of where they lived, the kind of jobs people did, and what they wanted to do in the future. I've gone on to write a number of academic papers, book chapters like this one, and I even made a film about the Garden Cities movement, which has been watched, I think, by at least a dozen people in the 10 years since. I've had the privilege of sharing my research with the Education Select Committee back in October, and on national radio and press. I was on LBC at the weekend talking about this stuff too. More recently, and I think most importantly, I've spent hundreds of hours of field work at the Centre for Education and Youth in schools and colleges, length and breadth of the country, talking to young people about their plans for the future and how these plans are shaped by their context. So when I was discussing titles for this book with Loic back in 2016, and we settled on young people on the margins, I knew instantly what the focus of my chapter would be. And if anyone's just joined, once I've got going, wonderful to see you. Jump on the chat, introduce yourself and pose any questions that you've got. Thanks again for joining us. So I wasn't the first person to be interested in how young people's lives are shaped by the areas they grow up in. We've long known that young people's outcomes vary widely depending on where they grow up. And area-based policymaking in education goes back at least 50 years to the education priority areas of the 1960s. So we've been looking at this stuff for a really long time. But the fact that area level disparities are still so stark just shows that these policies haven't really been very effective. And current policies like opportunity areas are unlikely to change that, I think. The truth is, when it comes to educational inequality, we still don't talk about areas or neighbourhoods in a way that really gets under the skin of the problem. In my chapter, I argue that we tend to talk about the areas where young people grow up in two ways. And I think both of these have real shortcomings. First, we talk about deprived areas using tools like the index of multiple deprivation. It's a useful tool for many things, but it suggests there's a simple sliding scale of more and less deprived areas. This fails to distinguish between areas that are similarly deprived but differ starkly in other ways. For instance, Blackpool and Hackney are similarly deprived, both quite deprived, but they have starkly different ethnic compositions, labour markets, and youth outcomes. So we talk in terms of deprivation, we group together places that are actually meaningfully really quite different. Second, and the current set of opportunity areas are a good example of this one, we focus on specific geographical locations, Derby, Hastings, Norwich. We're often guided by outcome measures. So opportunity areas are defined by their youth outcomes and school standards. But this means there's little to say about the features of those areas that cause young people to have poor outcomes. We're guided by the symptoms, not the causes. Oh, I've been moving my slides around. Just to keep you on your toes. There's an alternative in my view. So we've got those two methods that we tend to use to talk about types of area. And I think actually there's a better way. As we're all joining this breakout room, I suggested you might want to try out the output area classification tool to see what type of area you live or work in. And if you haven't done it yet, feel free to do it now while I'm talking. There's a link in the chat, and it's quite interesting if you've not done it before. There's more detail in my chapter and in the suggested readings in my chapter about how statisticians put together area typologies. The starting point is really similar to deprivation measures. Lots of different measures of things like material environment, local labour market, demographics, the age, ethnicity, health of local residents. But rather than boil all of this down into a single score for an area, like deprivation measures, area types classify areas into sets of places with similar clusters of characteristics. So areas in one set might be deprived areas that are ethnically diverse, inner urban and largely high rise, but areas in another set might also be deprived to the same extent, but they might be mainly white, outer urban, mainly low rise terraces. And that, in my view, is a really important difference. And it's a difference that's just not captured by sliding scale measures like the index of multiple deprivation, which we all use so much to talk about young people and schools and neighbourhoods. So it's well worth looking at that tool that I posted in the chat to get a feel for what we mean by types of area. It's a theme that I talk about a lot in the chapter, and I think sometimes just visualising it is the best way to understand it. So talking in terms of area types allows us to make more meaningful distinctions between different areas and to describe exactly why two deprived areas feel so different. But in practical terms, what's the benefit? Well, first, my own research suggests that area type has more predictive power than deprivation. So I've shown that pupils attending schools in cosmopolitan inner city areas outperform those in hard-pressed outer urban areas by almost 1.5 grades in every GCSE they sit, even though both of those contexts are basically deprived to the same degree. I also uncovered that young people from deprived outer urban areas are about 5 times less likely to aspire to professional jobs than their peers in inner urban but equally deprived neighbourhoods. Second, as you can see from that interactive map, if you've had a go on it, each type of area appears in hundreds of different locations all across the country. So take hard-pressed neighbourhoods, I think they're yellow on that map, relatively deprived areas on the edges of towns and cities, which I argue in the chapter should be our main focus. You can find these types of neighbourhoods all across the country from Penzance to Berwick. Although they might sit hundreds of miles apart, we know they have substantial and meaningful features in common. Those places belong to the same type of area. And this, I think, allows us to formulate coordinated national policies. If a policy works in one hard-pressed neighbourhood, it's likely to work in others, even if they're not next door to each other. And I don't think that can be said for two areas that get the same score in terms of deprivation. A key argument in my chapter is that we should try to cut ourselves loose from the existing language of deprived, disadvantaged, coastal inner city areas and talk more specifically and meaningfully in terms of types of area. I think this shift could have a transformative impact on the way we talk about areas and area-based inequalities and the way that we target policies and budgets. In my chapter, I also argue that we'd have far more luck tackling area-based inequalities if we also embraced two other changes. And I wanted to really briefly touch on those now before I wrap up and we have a discussion about it all. First, we need to pay far more attention to how young people themselves perceive, understand, and make sense of the areas they live in. In area-based research, we tend to call this place. Place, how young people understand their neighbourhood context, contrasts with space, which is how we, as researchers, practitioners, define neighbourhoods with statistics. I spent 2 years in Manchester talking to young people about how they made sense of life in what people often from outside the area called a deprived white working class neighbourhood, a neighbourhood that had achieved unhappy notoriety after years of high profile media coverage. I realised that although the young people I was getting to know all lived in the same neighbourhood, they held a really wide range of feelings about that neighbourhood. A key observation for me was that young people can be really attached to their neighbourhood, almost territorial sometimes, even when they're acutely aware of its shortcomings and its stigma and its reputation. And when it comes to policy, that means we need to be far more aware of a key, but I believe highly problematic assumption that we make about young people when we're talking to them about their futures, their aspirations. The assumption that they'll happily move out in order to move on, that they can be totally footloose in the search for opportunities. We often impose this assumption on the most marginalised young people with the fewest resources. Careers advice, I think, is just one area that needs to wake up to the importance of place. Finally, we need to pay more attention to the concrete ways that neighbourhoods shape young people's lives. We need to try and understand causal stories rather than just simple associations between areas and outcomes. So today, in 2021, it's relatively easy to identify local areas where young people's outcomes fall short. There's tons of data, maps, and locally targeted policy initiatives, just like the current opportunity areas. But we're really bad at explaining how and why young people's lives are shaped by the neighbourhoods they grow up in. If you take time to talk to young people, it's not long before you begin to uncover complicated stories about how their lives and aspirations are shaped by all manner of things: housing, the quality of public spaces and amenities, local service provision, and not just youth provision, all kinds of service provision, the kinds of jobs people do locally, social capital, who they know, the presence of family and friends, local history, traditions, customs, stigma, reputation, and bus routes. To come back to where I started, decades of research shows that young people's aspirations, expectations, and their ability to engage with opportunities often shaped heavily by the availability, accessibility, and affordability of transport links. So it's often the small day-to-day details of life that impact most heavily on young people's life chances and explain why area level inequalities are so persistent in the face of grand national policies. Ultimately, if we want to support young people on the margins, we should spend more time talking to young people who live on the margins. So that was a really, really sort of high-speed summary of what I have in my chapter. I think we have some time. The time has not come up yet, which means we do have some time for discussion. I'm glad to see that you've been engaging with the tool. That's brilliant. I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other more clearly. If anyone's got any questions they want to raise, now's the time, I think. I'll also be looking through the chat, but if anyone wants to jump in, I can see everyone. So I think a good old-fashioned hand raise or a wave or some kind of noise is all that's required, and we can get going.
Sam,
James, James, and then Maggie, I'll come to you, and we'll see if we've got time for any more. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. And I think wave trumps a shout, therefore. Sam, thanks very much for this. My name's James. I work with Manjit and the team at Reach, and my responsibility is to think about how we can share some of the work that's been done in Feltham across the system. One of the things I'd love to hear from Sam and others who know about this is, where are the areas where people feel some of the more joined up working or that takes place into account have been done most effectively? We're really conscious that this is, that there's lots been done on this before, and I'd just love to hear about examples that people can give, or even work, or what are the features of the kind of work that has made that joined up work sort of last, not just as a sort of policy flash in the pan, but where the relationships or other things that matter have been deep enough to sustain it.
Great question. Maggie, should we come to you as well and maybe take 2 or 3 at once and then see where we go with that?
Yes. So hi everybody. I live and I work in Hackney, and Sam knows, sort of feel very passionate about what goes on in here. I work for the education department of the council here. Really, it was partly more of a comment to say I think this idea of area type and space and places is absolutely where we should be at, and that lived experience of young people. And I know in Hackney we have many strategies looking at this, so I'm really wanting to see how can we really drive and hone in on exactly the issues that you're raising now. Where can we look to, if anywhere, but what could you point us to do in our borough here?
Brilliant. Thank you, Maggie and James. I definitely have some thoughts, James, on some area-based approaches, but then I think it would be wonderful to hear from other people here too. What comes to my mind are things like the children's communities, which are run by Save the Children. Evan, you're here from West London Zone. We know a lot about the work that you do. That's a very established and promising approach. I think the Harlem Children's Zones in the States are an interesting international case study. There's fascinating work being done in Manchester. It's a great partnership between the university. So Ruth Lupton at the University of Manchester and local schools are working together on kind of closer place-based working. And the last one I think that pops into my head was in Enfield. The local authority there, I think a good example of how the local authority can help to bring together the assets that a community has. So something I didn't mention, but I think is important, is that we often focus on what communities lack or what their needs are, but actually all communities have assets. I think Enfield, in Enfield, the local authority has been key in marshalling those and sort of redefining what the area means to people. So, but if anyone else had any examples, then I'd love to hear from you, and I think James would like to hear too. And you can always pop them in the chat. Maggie, was it a point about Hackney specifically that you wanted some steer on?
No, not at all.
Sorry, I've missed your point.
Yeah, just in hearing, it is what you're talking about, but so how could we translate that into Hackney? But I don't mean about Hackney specifically, it's picking up on the points that you're making, which I think are incredibly valuable and fascinating, and yes, the direction of travel that we need to be going in. It's just to sort of add to that, we've been doing a lot of work in Hackney on, it's very broad work across schools and looking at young people and their sense of belonging, and taken this as our absolute driver. But it's just, we're probably beginning on that journey. So trying to hear your views on this idea of place and how we connect with young people and how we draw on some of the learnings.
Mm. And actually in Hackney, you'll know the Hackney Youth Voices project, and that for me was a really wonderful and quite recent example of a project that went out to speak to young people about what the area means to them. I think what's fascinating about it is that when you say something like that, you think, oh, but we do that all the time, don't we? But actually we don't really, especially if we're teachers or practitioners working with young people, we have those conversations daily. But in terms of a coordinated, multi-month period of time, kind of almost like a consultation with young people. That's often precisely the kind of exercise they're not involved in, and the stuff they come up with in terms of what Hackney means to them, where they can and can't go, the things that they think are kind of on limits or off limits was really fascinating. And that's kind of a resource now for everyone to use. Melissa, did you have your hand up? I think you're muted. In fact, I know you're muted.
I was being good a bit. So yes, I'm Melissa Ben, and I'm a writer, I suppose, as well as other things. Mine's a point of clarification, because I've read your chapter and I've read the book and thought it was really interesting. But my understanding from reading the chapter and from your presentation this morning is that there is this distinct difference between what you might call inner city deprivation, where there are some advantages educationally, you said that, and the outer areas that you're talking about. So Hackney, for example, would be an example of a place that had some advantages in terms of cultural capital compared to some of the other more outer lying areas. Am I right in thinking that's what you're arguing?
Yeah, I guess this is where kind of averages come in. So on average, I mean, Hackney is an inner London borough. And on the whole, at the aggregate, we know that that's a part of the country that's done relatively well recently, due in large part to kind of real local efforts and transformation. Speaking to teachers and young people in boroughs that are near to the centre of London, and we've only got about 45 seconds left, so I'm sorry if this is our last discussion point, but I was fascinated to hear over the years that actually there's that classic thing of young people can live within sight of the Docklands, they can see Canary Wharf, but that doesn't mean they can access it or go there or see any kind of that they will ever end up working somewhere like that. So I don't think it's simple as saying, if you're in the inner city, you're surrounded by stuff, therefore you can access it and you're fine. But I think there is a reason why when you go to inner urban areas of deprivation, I think it's almost like the glass floor is set a bit higher. You've at least got some of the raw materials, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the right things are going to happen and young people are going to be able to access those. So yeah, that's a really good question. I'm really sorry that we've had to stop there, and thank you so much for joining it. I think we're going to be sent back now. We've been granted an extra 50 seconds. We're such a generous bunch at CfEY, aren't we? I think that is a really key point, and that's the kind of thing that it's hard to discuss the nuance of in a short space of time. But I think as we do more research on this sort of area, I think that will kind of come out more strongly.